The system you live under is breaking in plain sight. Here's the contradiction. Everything feels chaotic, louder, more unstable by the week, but the decisions driving that chaos don't look random at all. They look intentional. And if that's true, then this isn't just about politics or foreign policy. It's about the rules that quietly decide how safe your money is, how expensive your life becomes, and how much control voters actually have left. You're told the global order exists to protect stability. Yet the same order keeps producing crises that never fully resolve, wars that don't end, sanctions that boomerang, alliances that feel more like obligations than protection. That tension isn't accidental. But here's the part nobody says out loud. When a system starts defending itself instead of the people inside it, every move begins to look irrational, unless you know who it's really trying to protect. Because once you stop asking what went wrong and start asking who benefits, the story flips fast, and the next detail changes everything. What actually triggered this moment wasn't a single election, a war, or a headline. It was a quiet shift in how power started talking about itself. Instead of defending the existing order, key decisions began treating it as a problem to be managed, even dismantled. Not all at once, piece by piece. Publicly, this still gets framed as normal disagreement. Allies disagree, institutions argue, democracies debate. But underneath that surface, something more structural is happening. The post-World War II framework, the one designed to lock in a specific hierarchy of power, is being questioned from the inside, not by outsiders, but by the very states that once enforced it. Notice what's missing from most coverage. There's very little discussion about whether the system itself still serves the countries trapped inside it. Instead, every disruption is treated as a mistake, a miscalculation, or a personality clash. That framing keeps you focused on drama instead of direction. So here's the reframing question that changes how you see this entire story. What if the instability isn't a failure of leadership, but the cost of exiting an arrangement that no longer works? Because once that question is on the table, the next moves stop looking confused. They start looking coordinated. Here's the claim that reframes everything. The most disruptive moves of the past few years weren't defensive reactions. They were deliberate stress tests. Look at the pattern. Long-standing alliances were suddenly treated as negotiable. Language that once sounded sacred became conditional. Agreements that had survived decades were questioned in public, not behind closed doors, on camera, at podiums, in phone calls that were meant to be seen as unusual. That wasn't clumsiness. What wasn't clumsiness? That was signal. When a system is stable, leaders protect it quietly. When a system becomes a liability, leaders expose its pressure points. And that's exactly what started happening. Financial commitments were framed as burdens. Security guarantees became leverage. Institutions that once spoke with moral certainty suddenly had to justify their own existence. Now notice what wasn't emphasized. There was no replacement plan announced, no clean alternative presented. That absence wasn't a gap, it was a tactic, because naming a new structure too early would have unified resistance against it. This is where the story tightens. You don't weaken a complex system by attacking it head on. You weaken it by forcing it to defend itself in public over and over until everyone sees how fragile it actually is. And once that happens, escalation isn't a choice anymore. It's baked in. This is where the pressure started to compound. Once those stress points were exposed, every reaction made the situation louder. Allies began responding emotionally instead of strategically. Statements got sharper, red lines multiplied, emergency meetings became routine. What used to be unthinkable started sounding normal, even reasonable, simply because it was repeated often enough. This kind of escalation has a familiar shape. When an old framework starts slipping, the first instinct isn't reform, it's reinforcement, more rules, more declarations, more insistence that nothing fundamental is changing. But that insistence itself becomes a tell. Systems that are secure don't need constant reassurance. Watch how quickly extraordinary measures became background noise. Sanctions escalated without clear exit paths. Military commitments were discussed in hypotheticals that would have been taboo years earlier. Economic pain was reframed as necessary discipline, not temporary, indefinite. Here's why that matters. Normalization is power's last defense. If people accept permanent emergency as the baseline, the system buys time. But it also exposes its dependency on fear and momentum rather than consent. And this is where the story flips again. Because once escalation becomes routine, it stops being controllable. Now comes the contradiction that doesn't go away once you see it. Publicly, the language stayed calm. Commitment, unity, shared values, stability. But the actions underneath told a different story. Funding was delayed, then rerouted. Promises were narrowed, then reworded. Responsibilities were quietly shifted away from the center and pushed outward. The words projected strength. The behavior revealed caution. This is the moment where perception and reality split. If leaders truly believed the system was solid, they wouldn't need to manage expectations so carefully. They wouldn't need to emphasize resolve while reducing exposure. That mismatch is the signal. Notice what they avoided committing to: open-ended guarantees, automatic responses, anything that removed flexibility. Every move preserved an exit ramp, even while publicly denying one existed. That's not confidence, that's hedging. Here's the line that permanently changes how this looks. Systems that expect to last don't prepare for graceful withdrawal, they double down. What you're seeing instead is quiet risk management at scale. Once you accept that, a lot of confusing behavior snaps into focus. The hesitation, the contradictions, the sudden interest in burden sharing, these aren't policy disagreements. They're signs of an order trying to reduce its own blast radius. And once that starts, the next phase isn't debate, it's acceleration. At this point, the situation stops moving in a straight line and starts stacking pressure. One development triggers another. Diplomatic channels heat up, then go quiet. Economic tools get deployed faster than their consequences can be measured. Military language tightens, then abruptly softens. None of these moves on their own feel decisive. Together they create a sense of constant motion without resolution. This is what loss of control looks like at the system level. Decisions are made to buy time, not to solve anything. Every action narrows options instead of expanding them. And the speed matters. When responses come faster than reflection, strategy gives way to momentum. Watch how often urgency is invoked. Deadlines, windows closing, moments that can't be missed. That language isn't about opportunity. It's about pressure. It signals that leaders are reacting to forces they no longer fully steer. Here's the uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this. What happens if this pace doesn't slow down? Because systems under constant stress don't usually collapse all at once. They fracture in places no one was watching. And that brings this story closer to everyday life than most people expect. This is where it stops being abstract and starts landing on you. When systems destabilize, the first impacts aren't dramatic headlines. They show up in smaller, quieter ways: prices that don't quite come back down, jobs that feel less secure even when unemployment numbers look fine, governments asking for patience while offering fewer guarantees in return. You feel it in how uncertainty creeps into normal decisions, whether to save or spend, whether to move, whether the rules that applied last year will still apply next year. None of that feels ideological, it feels personal. What's striking is how often ordinary people are told this is temporary, that stability will return once the next vote happens, or the next agreement is signed, or the next crisis passes. But the lived experience keeps saying something else, that volatility itself is becoming the baseline. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Not because it proves a point, but because it tells a truth most coverage skips. Systems don't fail all at once. They slowly transfer risk downward, away from institutions and onto individuals. And once that shift happens, the real question isn't who's in charge. It's why the system is built to offload pressure onto the people least able to absorb it. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to step back from personalities and look at incentives. Large systems don't move because of values, they move because of leverage. Institutions protect whatever keeps them relevant, funded, and insulated from blame. When a framework starts failing, the instinct isn't to admit it. It's to shift responsibility outward while preserving control at the center. That's why you see spectacle paired with inertia, loud statements, dramatic summits, urgent messaging. All of it creates the impression of action, while the underlying mechanics remain untouched. Fear becomes a management tool. Uncertainty keeps people focused on survival instead of structure. Here's the unsettling insight. A system under threat doesn't need to convince you it's right. It just needs to convince you there's no alternative. As long as the cost of questioning it feels higher than the cost of enduring it, compliance holds. This is why reform always seems to stall at the edges. The core incentives never change, the risk is always externalized, and the pressure keeps flowing downward. Once you see that mechanism, the chaos stops feeling mysterious. It starts feeling functional, and that raises a harder question about where this trajectory leads next. From here, the path forward splits, but neither direction looks calm. One path is stabilization without reform. The system tightens controls, absorbs short-term shocks, and buys time. Volatility stays high but managed. Crises are spaced just far enough apart to prevent rupture. From the outside it looks like resilience, from the inside it's exhaustion. Momentum continues but trust erodes quietly. The other path is faster realignment. Commitments get rewritten, dependence unwind, power shifts towards structures that promise flexibility instead of permanence. That transition isn't clean. It produces gaps, confusion, and sharp corrections, but it also reduces the need for constant emergency framing. Risk moves again, just not where it used to sit. Notice what's already forming. Language is changing. Long-term certainty is being replaced with optionality. Leaders talk less about permanence and more about adaptability. That's not optimism, it's preparation. The most important detail is this: neither path waits for consensus. Movement is already underway, shaped by incentives and constraints that don't pause for public debate. And the next signal won't come as an announcement. It'll come as a decision that quietly closes one option and opens another. Here's the insight that pulls the whole story together. What you're watching isn't a sudden breakdown. It's a slow withdrawal from a system that no longer justifies its own costs. The noise, the contradictions, the constant sense of crisis all serve a purpose. They distract from the fact that foundational commitments are being renegotiated in real time. Once you see that, the confusion clears. Chaos isn't evidence of incompetence. It's camouflage. While attention stays locked on personalities and headlines, structures are shifting underneath, quietly, irreversibly. This is why each crisis feels unresolved. They aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to create cover while pressure is redistributed and obligations are reduced. By the time stability is promised again, it will rest on different assumptions than before. The deeper question isn't whether the old order survives. It's whether people notice the transition while it's happening or only after the rules feel unfamiliar. If you want to understand the next layer of this shift, follow for continued analysis. Because the most important changes are rarely announced. They're felt,